Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome. This is session J3, Acquisition and Elevation Projects, Guidance and Successes. First, I want to thank our sponsor, Quality Engineering and Surveying. And this has been a great conference, and it's the last session, so we'll get right into it. Our first presenter is Kathy Hopkins. She's a mitigation specialist with the Texas Water Development Board, and her presentation is to elevate or not to elevate? That is the question.
Hi, my name is Kathy Hopkins, and I work for the Texas Water Development Board. I'm so happy to be here today to share my presentation to elevate or not to elevate. That is the question at the 2020 ASFPM annual conference. The Texas Water Development Board administers the Flood Mitigation Assistance Grant Program on behalf of Texas. We have received over $300 million since the early 80s. And given that we've had a long history of doing tons of acquisitions and drainage projects, and then about 2008, we started working on conducting elevation projects within the state. And there's always been a lot of questions that I get is, do I prefer elevation or acquisitions, mitigation, reconstruction? What is the best mitigation types? And so in this presentation, I'm going to kind of go over lessons learned, things to consider when you're just trying to decide if you're going to elevate a structure or not elevate a structure. And I'm going to kind of touch on each one of these at a very high level overview of what you should consider and when you should elevate and when you shouldn't elevate. So there was a professor in Purdue, and he studied chickens. He studied the productivity of chickens. And so he went about this experience because he wanted to see how could he increase the productivity of the chickens. So he had two separate flocks that he worked with. The first flocks was just your average chickens. They did average egg production. And so he set up this flock and he monitored it for 6 generations. The second flock that he was monitoring was composed of chickens that were high performers, high producers. And every year he would go through, every generation, he would go through and produce and just select the highest producing chickens for production purposes, for reproduction purposes. And he monitored it also for 6 generations. Well, at the end of the study, he went and checked on both flocks. The first flocks was high producing, very plump, very feathered group of chickens. They were producing eggs and they maintained their numbers and they were doing really well. The second flock, on the other hand, there's only 3 of them remaining. And they had basically pecked all the other chickens to death because they were competing. And so people come to me and they always, like I mentioned earlier, they always say, well, which mitigation project is the best mitigation project? And I'm just like, there isn't one mitigation project that's the absolute best mitigation project out there. They have to work together jointly in order to come up with 100% mitigation for flood mitigation. It's just, there's not just one solution out there. Similar to the chickens, the first flock, they worked together as a group and they were able to be productive. They had, they were the healthiest, they had the most feathers, they were producing eggs, and they were getting along very well. And they have been very successful at maintaining their numbers. Whereas the second flock, who were the super chickens, the super mitigation project, they weren't maintaining what they were doing, and they ended up not having the solution. So the first piece of the puzzle when it comes to mitigation is that you must consider all mitigation options before you select your final mitigation option or just select elevation. So the different types of mitigation options that we have under the Flood Mitigation Assistance Grant Program is acquisition demolition, mitigation reconstruction, dry flood proofing, drainage or localized flood risk reduction projects, structural and non-structural retrofits. Those are the type of projects that we look at. Some other mitigation options that you might want to consider is your flood prevention ordinances, or orders, outreach, letting people know their risk, understanding their risk. And then the other one that I really don't promote, and that's do nothing. So the mitigation, when you're looking at an area, you have to look at the depth of the flooding. You have to look at the situation. Every community is different. We have large communities that there's lots of room that you can move people around. You can move them out of the floodplain. And then we have smaller communities that are pretty much the whole entire community, except for one or two structures, is going to be located outside of a floodplain. So it's really hard to, do we acquire all of those homes? No, because if we did that, we wouldn't have a community left. Is there an option to move the community? Probably not. So you have to look at what is going to be best for that individual community. So some of the things that you have to do when you're looking at mitigation, you have to do your own work. You have to know the history of flooding within the community, the frequency, the depth of flooding, the flood risks, high water marks, etc. The community, you have to understand what the community can support. Can the community support doing a ton of acquisitions because they have a lot of real estate where people can move within the community and won't affect their tax base? You have to understand what the conditions exist for that individual community. You have to listen to what the citizens want. I mean, you can, as a community, can decide, oh, we're going to do a whole bunch of acquisitions, but if the homeowners don't want to be acquired, since the program's voluntary, they're not going to want to move. So you have to understand what the citizens want. You also got to you have to understand what can they afford. What I mean by that is that all grant programs, in most cases, have a cost sharing requirement. And in the FMA grant program, or Flood Mitigation Assistance Grant Program, if you're a severe repetitive loss structure, you get 100% funding. But if you're not, then you're going to have some form of cost sharing. So is the community going to be able to make up that cost share requirement for the grant program? Or is it going to be the individual citizens? Is it going to be passed down to them to be able to meet that local match requirement? And do those property owners have the ability to make those local matches? The other thing is you have to decide where the funding is going to come from. Is it going to come from the Flood Mitigation Assistance Grant Program? Is it going to come from another one of the Hazard Mitigation Assistant Grant Programs that FEMA administers? Is it going to come from HUD through the Community Development Block Grants? So you have to know where the funds are going to come in order for you to do these types of mitigation projects. Once you go through all of this process, you have to decide, why should we elevate? In most cases, communities want to keep the tax base within their communities, so they decide that they're going to elevate. They also look at, should we do, they look at the condition of the structures. Are they going to be able to withhold being elevated? There's so many different factors you have to consider. So make sure you do your homework and you understand what type of mitigation action is going to work best for you. It could be in the subdivision, you elevate 4 of the homes that are within the floodplain, and the other 6 of the homes that are in the floodplain, you do acquisitions. Or you do a drainage project and the surface water elevation lowers it to X amount, and you still have this remaining pool of homes in this area that you want to find a mitigation solution. And you might do some elevations, you might do some acquisitions. But don't depend on one type of mitigation action to solve your complete problem, your flood risk problem that you're having within your community. So why should you elevate, or why should you mitigate your structure? Well, this graphic, I think, speaks for it by all terms. When we do mitigation, what we found that every dollar spent for mitigation, especially in riverine type situations or in areas that we see hurricane surge, we probably get, for every dollar spent in mitigation, we get $7 in return. And then if we just look at globally on the different types of mitigation projects, for every dollar spent, we get $6 in return. So mitigation, investing in mitigation in the end is going to drive a high benefit cost. And a lot of the structures that we mitigate here in Texas are along our coastal areas or in riverine areas. And, I've seen where homes actually increase in value after we elevate the structures, because we've raised them up above the floodplain and those structures aren't repeatedly receiving damage anymore. So they're actually being able to maintain their integrity. So what are some advantages to elevations? Well, one of the biggest advantages to elevations is that it reduces the flood risk to the structure and its contents. The structures are elevated above the base flood elevation and sometimes even higher. They're also brought into compliance with your current floodplain management ordinances. There are such a large pool of elevation contractors out there that are so qualified at elevating structures. The techniques are so well known that, you know, here in Texas, knock on wood, we have not had one structure fail when we elevated it. We've done all the pre-engineering, and even while we're lifting it, there's been some cases that we've had to stop what we were doing, look at the engineering, because the slab actually was not strong enough to withstand the elevation that we were doing, which we initially thought it was. So then we have to redo the engineering, and then we stabilize the foundation and continue with elevation. So the techniques are out there and they're very well known. Elevation reduces to the homeowners, to your property homeowners and the citizens. It reduces the physical, the financial, and the emotional strain that comes with accompanies flooding. So, speaking with homeowners after a flood, they're totally devastated. And, me personally, growing up in the Houston area and experiencing flooding, it is emotionally draining, and it is so hard to get over, because in some cases, you pretty much lose everything if it's a devastating flood event. Or it's the emotional chore of trying to clean your house up so that you can get back into it, thinking about where you're going to live, all your memories and everything. So elevation reduces that stress. It keeps the tax base within the community. Elevations in most cases will reduce your flood insurance and avoid future increases. And, most of the time when somebody says, okay, I have to elevate my structure 6 feet, and then there's the freeboard is another foot, so I'm going up 7 feet. And, when I talk to them, I'm like, well, you want to go up an extra foot or so that you can have access to storage, parking, and access to your structure underneath. And, that 1 extra inch sometimes, makes the world of difference. So it's good to promote that. Some of the disadvantages of elevations. The structure remains in the special flood hazard area. Even though we've hopefully raised it above where the flooding event will occur, we still have that structure located in the floodplain. Another thing is the community might have to still provide emergency services during a flood event. So that has to be taken into consideration. And through, once we elevate the structure, the community has to monitor that structure to ensure that it stays in compliance, and meaning they're not enclosing it, because a lot of communities, at least in the state of Texas, will require 3-side enclosures. And so it's really easy to close that 4th side, and the next thing you know, they're doing sheetrock and they're pouring a foundation underneath it. So one of the things is the community has to continually monitor those properties to ensure that it's being maintained for access, storage, and parking below that elevated area. So what is the elevation roadmap? First you got to identify the available funding sources. And, I always turn to the Hazard Mitigation Assistance Grant Program, because that's what I administer, one of those programs. The community has to determine its technical capabilities. Are they able to administer this grant program? And if they're not able to administer the grant program for elevation, then they need to seek certified contractors or grant administrators to help them with that. So they need to look inside themselves. So once you find the funding, you need to also find out your capabilities. Are you able to develop an application? Are you able to do the administration? And you would think that, the larger communities, they'll be able to do all of that in-house. And the smaller communities are the ones that would need the grant administrators. Most of the cases, a lot of our smaller communities, they're actually administering their own grants. It's the larger city of Houston's and Harris County Flood Control District that use a lot of outside help in their administration. So across the board, it's a little bit different, but you have to find out and you have to determine your community's technical abilities. FEMA has tons of publications. Most of y'all are probably familiar with them, so I'm not going to really go through all of them here, but these are the ones that I quite frequently refer to when we're elevating structures. And so I'm going to go into the next slide here. So when you're developing an application, what are the good things that you have to have or do when you're developing the application? So here in the state of here in Texas, what I do is I promote to all of my communities that they host a public meeting with the selected property owners that they want to mitigate. So if their objective is to mitigate all their severe repetitive loss and repetitive loss structures, then I ask them to host a public meeting with these homeowners. And we will come, the Texas Water Development Board will come and present at these public meetings. We will present about the grant program, how it works, what the expectations are, and we meet with the community to find out, are you going to be making the local match? Are you going to require that it be passed down to the homeowners? What things are you going to be expecting from your homeowners? So we start building that relationship with the communities right away. And these public meetings, when we're having these public meetings, we ask that the homeowners provide, or these property owners, provide supporting documentation that we're going to need to develop the application, which saves time, cost, and energy when we're developing these applications, because we do not have to come up with these resources. So some of those pieces of information that we ask for is a copy of their NFIP declaration page, the flood loss history, photographs of the structures, all four sides. Make sure you focus on the foundation, the flood loss history. We asked them, or not flood loss history, I just said that, sorry about that. We asked for a property sketch. So basically, show us the perimeter of your property, show us where your doors, your entrances, and your easements are. Show us, like, I mean, is your house a box? Do you have lots of little boxes together? Do you, show us what it is, because that helps us estimate how much it's going to cost to elevate the structure. We ask for elevation certificates or any elevation data that a homeowner might have on it. What are the high water marks during a flood event within your house? How high did the water get? We also, ask for a location map, property information. When was your house built? What's the estimated value of your structure? Most of the time we can pull that from CAD, but sometimes a homeowner might just recently have had an appraisal done on the property, and we can use that information to help develop our application. The other thing that is pretty important is your scope of work. The who, what, when, where, and how. When you're developing your application, make sure you answer all of those questions. The most important thing that I find that helps when you're developing an application and administering the application is a well-defined and developed budget. It needs to include all costs, and it needs to include every aspects or every step of the way, and it needs to be detailed out. And so when you do that, you also need to include a narrative. How did you develop that cost? How did you come up with the elevation cost for a one-story home or a two-story home when you're going up 3 feet, 4 feet, 5 feet? How did you derive those costs? And how did you develop your temporary housing? That's one of the eligible items underneath there. Are you going to have to require, are these homeowners going to need an ADA compliant structure, meaning a lift or a ramp to get into the house? All of that needs to be found in that detailed scope of work. You need to know where your source of local match is going to come from. You need to have a strong benefit cost analysis. You make sure that you include all your environmental and historic preservation documentation in there so that it easily passes those reviews when it gets to FEMA for consideration. What are some implementation considerations? And so you'll notice on these slides, I bolded certain things because I didn't want to go into a whole bunch of detail, but I wanted to hit the high level and provide you a little bit more details and things that have been most useful for me. And one of the biggest implementation considerations is that you've got to understand the NFIP insurance rating and the NFIP compliance. They are two separate things. They're not one and the same. You can have an NFIP compliant structure, but it's still, that structure is being rated as if it was never elevated and that it's still deep within the floodplain because you did not adhere to the requirements that you're going to need for insurance rating purposes. So know the difference between and know how to mitigate those structures. An example of that would be is if you had a breezeway that attached to a detached garage. If you leave that garage down on the ground and you don't detach that breezeway from the main part of the structure, it's a part of the same roof line. And so one of the things that we've done is that we'll elevate the breezeway, but we'll detach it from the primary structure of the house and keep it attached to the garage, which remains on the ground. And that way we don't have a continuous roof line. Because if you have that continuous roof line, then they'll rate the lowest portion of that structure, which would now be the garage on the ground, and they still would be getting those high insurance rates. And so if you're getting a high insurance rate, but you're still compliant with NFIP regulation, I still feel like in the state of Texas, we have considered that as that structure is not fully mitigated. So we look at both of the compliance side of the house and the insurance side of the house. Another thing that we recommend highly with our communities, and every community has done it, is they procure a pool of elevation contractors so that the homeowners can select from and that the community will review those bids. And so this has helped out a lot from, we know the quality of work that these elevation contractors are going to do. We know that they're going to adhere to the grant program. We know what their history is because they've been vetted. And procuring that pool of contractors is by far, I think, the best thing that we ever did. The first elevation project we did back in 2009, the homeowner called up an elevation contractor because we were going to just let the homeowner select their own elevation contractor. And I kid you not, when that elevation contractor came to the city to pull the permits, he had drawn on a napkin how he was going to elevate that structure. So you need to make sure that these elevation contractors, they have engineering plans, they have all the resources and the right type of equipment to elevate, that they're going to be using the unified jacking system, that they're going to pull the right kind of bonds. And the best way to do that is to procure them and have a pool of elevation contractors to work from. Also, one of the biggest things that I've learned about when we're implementing is that you need to review all bids. Every elevation bid needs to be reviewed for compliance with the grant program. And this can be done at the community level with the assistance of the state, but you need to make sure that all items in that bid are eligible under the grant program, because every now and then, you might get in there that they're going to put brick around the side of the house, or they're going to upgrade the irrigation system. I mean, we get some weird things. They're going to put in all this landscaping, and those things are not eligible under the grant program. So you have to be really careful. Make sure that the community develops an implementation plan and that you include it in part of your agreement with that community. You need to make sure that they have a good contracting vehicle with the homeowners and the elevation contractors. We've used both biparties and triparties agreements within the state of Texas, and it seems to work out really well because it's going to hit on all of the different things that need to be considered throughout the life of the grant program. Understand the complexity of the structures being elevated. In the city of Friendswood, we have multi-level, multi-foundation homes that are large and gigantic that we've lifted, and very highly complex structures to lift. So you've got to know what you're dealing with when you're lifting those structures. Another one is understanding your utility company's requirements. I kid you not, in the state of Texas, we have aerial easements, and when we elevate structures, we got to make sure we're not in line with those, that we stay outside of those aerial easements. Because if not, your utility companies aren't going to come and hook up those utilities again. Other considerations, you make sure that you have the right payment and performance bonds. There's different types of bonds. You got to understand the difference between the bonding company and the surety that comes into, if you have to pull those bonds, surety is going to come in and do all the work. It's not going to be the bonding company. So you got to make sure you have the right type of bonds. You have to make sure the right people are listed as parties to the bonds. I recommend the community, the homeowner, and the elevation contractor, all three of them be on those bonds. Know the difference between structural requirements and aesthetic requirements. Because aesthetic requirements, if it's not a part of your ordinances, aren't going to be eligible under the grant program. So if the HOA is requiring 4-side enclosures, you know, that 4-side enclosure is going to have to be paid for by the homeowner. So that's an additional cost outside of the grant program. So you need to know the difference between what the structural requirements are and what are aesthetic requirements. Other things is elevation of detached garages and breezeways, elevations of attached garages. You know, if you elevate the garage, you may not be able to put a driveway to it. So what are you going to do? That has to be addressed, because you can't just leave a gaping hole in the side of a house. Temporary housing. Limit the location of where they can go for temporary housing. You don't want them to go to Walt Disney World and you pay for their temporary housing while their house is being elevated. We usually limit within the county that they reside in, or within the school district that they reside in. We also cap the amount using the GSA rate. So whatever the GSA rate is for that community, that's what they get per day for temporary housing. So here are some examples of some elevations that we've done in Texas. We've done simple elevations where we've elevated 2.5 feet up, and we've done huge elevations where we've gone up at least 12 feet. As you can see here, the one on the top is, you know, fairly simple. It has a skirting all the way around. It's vented, which is a requirement. And then on the second one, these are both slab on grade too. I get a lot of questions of, can you elevate a slab on grade structure? And I'm like, oh yeah, it's easier to elevate in some cases a slab on grade than it is for me to elevate a house that's existing on pilings or piers. So yes, elevating slab on grade is definitely a doable item in the state of Texas. But the one on the bottom, you can see that there's obviously a lot of upgrades. This particular, you know, the grant program will pay for one set of stairs in the front and the back, so you have ingress and egress. This one, the homeowner paid for the extra set of stairs. Notice it's wood, it's not metal. If the homeowner wants to have the decorative metal railing going down the side of it, you know, those are, that's an extra and outside of the grant program. And I really recommend that you don't even allow it to occur during the elevation. Put the wooden stairs up there, and if the homeowner wants to upgrade at a later date, let them do it on their own dime and outside of the grant program, so you don't have any delays. But most of the time, it increases the value of the structures when we elevate these structures, because they're not getting that repetitive flooding. Also, you'll notice that there's one tree missing from the front of this house. We ended up having to move one of the trees because it was too close to the house while we were elevating it. So it had to be moved prior to elevation, which is an eligible cost under the grant program. Some words of wisdom. Elevation grants require a lot of work on all levels. There's a lot more monitoring involved in it at the state level. There's a lot of monitoring of it at the local level. And, you know, it's just a lot of work. So it's not like acquisitions. You don't acquire it, demo it, and then allow the structure to go back to its natural ways. And then you mow it every frequently, mow it on a mowing schedule. Elevation requires a little bit more work than what a lot of people are expecting. Property owners play a significant role in the grant progress, because this is their personal structures. This is their personal house. And it means a lot to them. And we're dealing with where their kids grew up. They're dealing where they celebrate Christmas. And there's a lot of emotional aspects that come with elevating a homeowner. So, my biggest thing is you have to keep that line of communication. You have to let them know what's going on. You have to listen to them. My next bullet is communication is a must. Grant programs aren't the fastest things in the world. Sometimes it can take a year to a year and a half before you're actually up and running and elevating these structures. Most of these homeowners have been affected by a flood event and they just want to get back to whatever normal is to them. And so it's very important that you communicate with them. You keep them in touch on each aspect of the grant process, the application process, the selection process, the award process. If you keep them informed with what's going on, half the time I don't get a phone call from them on the state level. Understand the NFIP policy ratings and compliance. Words of wisdom. I really do. I never thought I would have to know what it means to rate, how they rate properties and what factors they consider. But when we're elevating structures, people want to put, lifts on the side of the house, or a lift is required for ADA. The same thing for a ramp. You got to know what's required, and you got to know how to elevate these structures such that they're not going to be rated as if they're on the ground. Set expectations at all levels. Make sure they understand the timing, what is required. When you issue that notice to proceed, those homeowners have to know that, they have to remove themselves from the structure. If they're going to remove their contents, they need to schedule to have those contents removed. So you have to, let the homeowners know what's required. Let them know that they can't ask for extras and additional things outside of what the grant program is going to allow for. You need to ensure that you put controls in place to avoid fraud and abuse. And it happens. And sometimes it happens so innocently because it just made sense to do that, or the contractor says, oh yeah, I can do that for you for free. Well, that's fraud and that's abuse because you're getting something for free under a grant program, and that's just not allowable. Understand the local, state, and federal laws and regulations. That is a big must. State might have certain requirements. The locals might have certain requirements. We have in the community of Dickinson, they require that there's a single bay garage. And so if you elevate that structure to the fact that you can't have a driveway, then homeowner has to put some form of detached garage on their property. So you have to know what the laws are. And then seek assistance or help as soon as possible. If something doesn't look right or you have questions, make sure that you seek help, develop those partnerships. And, sometimes those partnerships can be actually the homeowners, or it can be a neighboring community, or it can be a state. I also say find mentors. When a new community comes to me and they say they're looking into doing elevations, I instantly tell them, please contact this community, this community, this community. Talk to them about what it's like to do an elevation project and listen to their best practices, because you're going to have to develop your own implementation plan. I do the same thing. I reach out to my state partners that I have and ask them, what are you doing over in this state? How are you handling this situation? Make sure that you have those good partnerships, because there will be a time when you're going to need to turn to somebody and say, okay, my elevation contractor just filed bankruptcy. I'm going to have to pull the payment and performance bonds. How do I go about doing that? What were the steps that you took? How long was the process? So make sure you build those types of relationships. And upon that, that's the conclusion of my presentation. Please let me know if you have any questions. Thank you.
Okay, well, that was a great presentation. And we do have quite a few questions coming in. The first one, have you seen very many communities having to deal with non-compliant enclosures, and how were those challenges addressed?
Not in the grant program, we haven't seen them after the elevation, but we do see them a lot in the coastal communities. And when that happens, it's usually caught during a CAV or a CAC. And we, the state, would require evidence that there's no living structures underneath, like picture evidence that there's no living facilities underneath the house. And so most cases, our communities will issue a non-compliance warning letter, basically saying, please provide us with pictures and showing that there isn't, or please allow us access to the lower level so that they can look in there for compliance. As part of the elevation, we do require our communities that have participated in the grant program to go out and verify that there are no enclosures every 3 years. Even though that's not a FEMA requirement, it is something that we ask our communities to do. So we do double check that through time, because most of our communities require 3-sided enclosures. And so it's real easy for them to close off that backside. Nobody sees it. And then once they close that backside, it's real easy to start, pouring a foundation and doing all kinds of stuff on the weekends.
Okay. And do you have any experience with elevation of non-residential buildings?
We have not had the opportunity to do one through our grant program yet. But I know in the Galveston area, especially on the Strand, we have elevated historic structures where we actually elevated the flooring inside the structure because we had the headspace, but we have not done any large commercial properties yet.
Okay. Well, I think we need to move on to the next presentation. Thank you, Kathy.
Thank you.
So our next presentation is the City of Austin Onion Creek Project. Show me the money and we'll show you the results. And this is Teri Morgan with HDR and Alex Gale with the City of Austin.
Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Alex Gale. I'm the acting director for the Office of Real Estate Services for the City of Austin. And today we're going to give a presentation on the City of Austin's Onion Creek Floodplain Buyout Program.
Hello, everyone. I'm Teri Morgan with HDR Engineering. I'm the South Central Region Lead from Austin, Texas, and I'm here to assist with the presentation on the City of Austin Onion Creek project. We'll be giving you information on several items today. We'll talk about the Onion Creek flooding history, the Onion Creek funding history. We'll give you some examples of the way that we were able to help the community in a time of crisis, and also what the funding was able to help with the city's parks and recreation areas. That was an example of what happened with the buyout program. First, a little bit about the Onion Creek flooding history. We have a news clip for you to view. Alex?
Well, Robert, since you were out here earlier today, the activity has decreased a bit, but still a lot of folks are busy out here, even in the dark. Throughout the day, families have been back and forth to their homes, sorting everything out. Although the water is gone for the most part now, an enormous amount of work is still left.
The water, we couldn't open the door. It was about 3.5, 4 feet inside.
The 73-year-old and his wife were stranded in their home for hours, finding ways to stay above the rising water. Now, cars are piled up in their front yard. Their fence is wrapped around trees. All over the Onion Creek neighborhood, a similar sight. All sorts of debris and belongings are scattered everywhere.
Just wondering how did all this water get here so fast, how did it get so high so fast, and how are we going to get out of it, really?
Chris Torres and his family spent much of the afternoon cleaning up, pumping out the water still standing inside, tearing out drywall, throwing out what's destroyed, boxing up what they can save, and hanging on to each other.
Just be happy we're still alive and go from there. It's a house, it's cars, they're all replaceable, and that's all there is to it, you know. Thank God that we're all okay.
A feeling echoed by many in the neighborhood. In the midst of destruction, they're thankful to have one another.
You know, we were sleeping. If it hadn't been for a neighbor, we wouldn't be here talking about how high the water got.
And several of those neighbors told police they were worried about looting. Well, APD has told us that they are very aware of those concerns. There is police presence here in this neighborhood, and they say they will continue those patrols throughout the night. Reporting live in Southeast Austin, Angie Bevan, KXAN News.
As you can see, very destructive, the creek flooding that happened several times. I'm going to give you a little bit about the history. Actually began in the mid-1970s when the neighborhood constructed a residential development right next to Onion Creek. In 1993, FEMA released new flood maps that raised the 100-year floodplain about 10 feet along the Onion Creek area, putting about 900 homes into the floodplain for the first time ever. Then in 1998, the Onion Creek had a flood and crested at 32 feet above normal. Again in 2001, it crested again in November to 36.5 feet. On Halloween night in 2013, there was a large flood event that caused an estimated $100 million in damages to homes and properties. Again, in October of 2015, on the day before Halloween, there was another historic flood event in Onion Creek. And now here's a little history about the funding of the Onion Creek project. In 1998, Austin voters approved $2.4 million in bonds to buy flood-prone homes near Onion Creek. The city purchases and raises about 40 homes over the next several years. And then in 2006, the Army Corps of Engineers recommends spending $76 million to buy an additional 483 homes near Onion Creek. This was through a federal match grant, including many already purchased properties by the city. However, Congress never approved the funding for the project, and now the cost has risen to $83.3 million. Austin then lands a $7.8 million FEMA grant to purchase homes in the floodplain area. In November of 2006, Austin voters also approved $28 million in bonds to fund the city's portion of the Army Corps of Engineers project. The city then buys and demolishes around 114 homes near Onion Creek over the next 3 years. Then in October of 2008, the city buys 100 more homes in the area using local taxpayer dollars. Due to the record flood on Onion Creek damaging more than 500 homes in 2008, with an insured loss or estimated at $30 million in Travis, Hayes, and Caldwell counties. And those costs did not count damaged vehicles. I'm going to turn this over to Alex now and let him give you more information concerning how the city actually went through the process of purchasing the homes and building park area for the results. Alex?
Thank you, Terry. I'd like to go through how the City of Austin helped people and the community helped the people in the time of the crisis. So first, we wanted to talk about the impact of the flood. So immediately after the Halloween 2013 floods, the project really grew overnight. A lot of local staff from multiple departments of the city, as well as volunteers, were called in to help provide support to the expanded project and help provide relief to those individuals. There were many structures that were damaged to a degree that was 50% or more value of the home that would be required repair. And so those implications led to hard decisions by many of the owners to decide if they wanted to make repairs to their home. Wanted to provide you some pictures of some of the destruction of the homes following the 2013 flood. As you can see on the left and right, people were dejected from the flood. It was heartbreak, but there was many in the community that supported them and wanted to show to help keep the individual's spirits up in this time of need. The city did want to instill confidence. Before the 2013 flood, many in the community did not believe that the city was going to be able to move forward with the buyouts because of lack of funding. The project had been in effect essentially by the city, the buyout, since 1998. And prior to that 2013 flood, property acquisitions were down to 1 or 2 a month due to that lack of funding. So following the October 2013 flood, the city did approve in 2014 spending $20 million to offer buyouts to the 116 or more property owners in the Onion Creek area. And then there was an impact of another flood. So once the city of Austin implemented the buyouts in 2014, another flood happened in almost 2 years to the date in 2015. And so there was the buyout project was already underway. And then again, this 2015 flood hits. The project experienced some delays in closings and presenting offers due to the impact of the flood and coming up with how the valuations were done and procedural changes of how the buyouts were going to happen when an emergency hits in the middle of a floodplain buyout program. So one thing that needed to be decided is determining if the appraisals of the properties are done as is with destruction of the homes, or if there was a pre-flood value that would be done by the appraiser to determine the fair market value that the city would offer. In this case, in 2015, the city decided to do pre-flood values of the homes and then make deductions by what insurance was provided to ensure that there was no duplication of benefits provided by the insurance companies that were, of course, provided by the FEMA. So in addition to that, the city of Austin granted a $15,000 life and safety of credit to property owners to assist with out-of-pocket expenses such as overnight stays, mold remediation, and disposal of a lot of the damaged structural materials so that those homeowners could clear out their homes to see if there was some way to still live within that property. This is a map of the project area. And what you can see, the teal color is the 25-year floodplain, and then this lighter shade of green is the 100-year floodplain. So the properties in gray, bordered by the dark blue, are the properties that were in the initial U.S. Army Corps of Engineer area, and then the properties that are in gray were those deemed part of the 25-year floodplain. And then the properties in orange were those structures and properties that were at risk in the 100-year floodplain. So you can see through the timeline how the buyout program progressed and how the properties were acquired. So between October 2008 and 2013, the city only had funding to purchase 100 of those properties in the floodplain. Once the flood hit in October 2013, the new buyout program started and was expanded and funding was provided. And so 259 properties were purchased during that basically 2-year period of January 2014 to October 2015. And then again, the flood hit again in October 2015, and the city was able to purchase an additional 276 properties as part of the buyout program. In doing the buyout program, other things have to be taken into consideration, such as the demolition. And so here's a few pictures showing the demolition of the properties, and there was a mix of mobile homes as well as single-family stick-built homes. And so all the things had to be taken into consideration, whether it was a federally funded or locally funded of the mold and asbestos remediation, as well as air monitoring, to ensure none of those particulates are released into the air during the demolition. And then we wanted to pivot and show you how providing the appropriate funding can show you the results of a buyout program. So as you can see, the slide gives a brief kind of summary of the different funding buckets that were provided for the Onion Creek Floodplain Buyout Program here at the City of Austin. U.S. Army Corps of Engineers provided $73.2 million total for the acquisition, and that we were able to acquire 483 properties at a federal cost share with U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. Of course, once the additional floods hit in 2013 and 2015, the city made the decision, city council, of course, to provide additional funds. And so there was $95.5 million in certificates of obligation that was able to acquire 343 properties in the 25 and 100-year floodplain. And then, FEMA was also, we were able to get a FEMA grant to secure an additional $1.5 million to purchase an additional 9 properties from the buyout area. But what we wanted to do is ensure when we're buying these properties is what was the city going to do with the space once that property was acquired. And early on, the conversations were being had of making this open space. And so as things progressed, there was a survey done in 2019 and even prior to that to get an understanding of what the community would like to see in the area. Based on the results of that survey, there was a management plan that provided closing some of the streets off that were no longer needed, designating areas as wildflower or natural areas, leaving a grow zone for water quality purposes, and then also setting aside areas for community gardens or sustainable farming, and as well as ensuring the public that the city would be mowing in areas near some of the residents that didn't want to participate in the buyout program, that they would mow in the area 6 times per year. And so what you can see when you get that buy-in to show we're listening to you and we want to provide something that benefits the community, then people will definitely support what they help create. So the results of that is a 555-acre regional park for the city of Austin. There's trails that connect not only to this area, but many areas throughout this Onion Creek watershed. This area right here is the actual area where the homes were, but it was able to connect to this greater Onion Creek Metro Park. So there's multiple trails, sidewalks around the trails and the parks, as well as ecosystem restoration to bring that area to its natural state and promote growth and get rid of invasive species that may be prohibiting that. This slide shows you the future of what the Lower Onion Creek Park area looks like. So this was initially just some of the programming before it was built, but it's pretty close to this. You can see the areas of the trails in blue, the areas in purple showing the amenities of the park area, which are parking, pavilions, bathrooms, multiple pavilions and places, park benches, and places for people to eat within the area. But you can see there was many streets within here that were closed off as part of providing this community space for the city. Just a couple snapshots of some of the park amenities that were provided here. You can see a playground, of course, for children, as well as a dog park that was made bigger to provide a space for individuals to have off-leash dog park for the community. A couple other pictures showing the pavilions as well as the picnic tables around that individuals and families and organizations can utilize within the park area, while providing kind of a natural area backdrop for them to enjoy. That does conclude the presentation that we have, and of course, Terry and I are here to help answer any questions you have, but our contact information is located at the bottom of the screen, and we would be happy if anybody has any additional questions, feel free to reach out to either one of us, and we can help answer any questions that you may have. So again, is there any questions for us?
Okay, thanks for that presentation. We did have a few questions come in for you guys. The first one is, Austin has very high housing costs and the photos look like there were minority, elderly, and LMI populations. Can you describe where families relocated to and were there additional tax dollars dedicated to assisting relocation?
Yes, so this area was in the southeastern area of Austin. The area is known for being a lower cost place to live in Austin, and so taking that into account, there were a population of minorities as well as other populations there. But in order to help the individuals relocate, we did provide a replacement housing payment under the Uniform Relocation Act. So under the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers area, we provided housing of last resort, meaning that we did go above the federally mandated $31,000 as long as we showed to the feds that there was the necessary justification to provide that relocation. As well as using the city tax funded dollars, we provided that same last resort housing. So there was a difference, a considerable difference for what we paid for the homes, the subject properties, and then what we offered in relocation assistance to essentially make the individuals and families whole. And what we found, it was a bit of maybe a 50-50 split between families and individuals staying in the Austin city proper, and those that did choose to go out further outside the city limits, whether it was into some of the surrounding suburbs of Austin.
Okay. Next question, does the city of Austin have a city ordinance for the buyout program or an internal policy? And if so, would you be willing to share?
So for each one of the buyouts, because we did have separate buckets, we tended to follow the same policy for each one, but we didn't have a specific ordinance necessarily that we followed, but I could share kind of what those policies were. We do have our general relocation policies that we follow, offering fair market value, providing relocation assistance to individuals, but what we did follow, what our city council passed is having us follow the Uniform Relocation Assistance Act. So we applied that standard to all of our buyouts, no matter where the funding came from, whether it was federal dollars or if it was local tax dollars. Our council approved us following that same standard to all of the different buyout areas within that location.
Okay. Was participation voluntary since funding was from city revenue?
Yes. Yes, some of the participation was voluntary. Some of the cities' funding was used for voluntary, and then the FEMA, of course, was voluntary. However, the Corps of Engineering parcels that we purchased with their funding was not voluntary, and so it was just determined on the demographics and the geographical area and the floodplains maps as to where that would be.
Okay, and I think that's about all the time we have for questions. Thank you, guys.
Thank you.
Okay, and our final presentation, slab home elevations for floodproofing, safety, education, training, and outreach. And this is by Yazdani, a professor at the University of Texas in Arlington.
Good afternoon. My name is Noor Yazdani. I'm a professor of civil engineering at the University of Texas at Arlington. And my co-presenter today is Dr. Maria Colo. She's assistant professor in the Department of Civil Engineering at Texas A&M University in College Station. So this presentation is very important. It's really deals with the important topic for flood mitigation in the coastal areas of Texas and elsewhere. It's the safety of slab home elevations in Harvey affected communities and beyond. So without further ado, I'm going to start the presentation. And this is a Sea Grant project, Texas Sea Grant self-funded project. It's a collaboration between UT Arlington, Texas A&M, and Sea Grant, and several other entities. I'll discuss this later on. So let me explain where UT Arlington is, in case you don't know. We are smack in the middle of the Dallas-Fort Worth huge metroplex with 7 million population. Fort Worth is 10 miles from Arlington, where the conference was supposed to be held. Unfortunately, it was canceled. And then Dallas, of course, 20 miles on the east. And we are sandwiched between I-20 and I-30, perfectly poised with the TWDB airport, a world-class airport, 10 miles from the campus. And UT Arlington has grown like crazy. Currently, we have 50,000 more students, and we are a tier 1 university, and we are proud of that. And we are the major civil engineering players in the North Texas community. In case you are in this area, please hit me up, and we can meet and show you around on campus and beyond. So coming back to the topic of the presentation, most of you probably know what it is. It's elevation of existing homes or new homes. Typically, coastal homes are built, especially the older homes. New ones may be built on stilts or elevation, while the older ones are built smack on the ground. So they have repeated flood damage, and insurance keeps paying for it. So the time for elevation is now, before the next event. It's not cheap. Okay, it may cost $100,000 or beyond, but it makes sense. And because of these issues, okay, elimination of future damage, repetitive damage, and not only the cost of the structure, but then the cost of the contents, the usage loss, and possible casualties. Improved appearance, hopefully. Okay, it looks nicer. It sits up from the ground. There is usable space in the bottom that someone can use for parking a car, for example, or storing stuff like lawnmowers and stuff like that. Of course, this is a disposable space during flood. The water is going to come underneath it. So, of course, there is a stair that has to be climbed up, and maybe a couple of more because if it's multi-story, for example. So this is the problem with the elevation of buildings. Before the building is done, there is a slab, concrete slab being cast. There is a welded wire mesh reinforcement, which is pretty flimsy. It's supposed to be in the middle of the slab, but typically sits on the bottom because of the construction issues. And this is the elevated structure. You can see here that the wire mesh is in the bottom. Essentially, it's not doing anything to increase the slab capacity. So the slab is pretty much a plain concrete slab with 4-inch thick. It's a low strength concrete, 2,500 to 3,000 PSI concrete, for example. So once it's raised, this plain concrete slab over a span of 6 feet, 8 feet, 10 feet, or 12 feet, it makes it very flimsy. And I'll explain that in the next few slides. So here you see that the slab had cracked, this actual photograph from the field, and the contractor tried to hide it by putting the steel plate here so that the crack is hidden. So this kind of thing occurs all the time. The concrete is deteriorate over time, the steel is rusted, and sometimes during the elevation process, the structure may fall on the side. So once that happens, you lose the contents, maybe, or some of it or most of it. The structure has to be rebuilt. It's an expensive process, and if it really happens more in the future, then there could be chance of injury or even death of the occupants. So during Harvey or post-Harvey, there's a lot of awareness of elevations of structures. People are aware of it. There's a push to elevate more and more structures. There are funding available for that. And there are signboards. I've seen them some in the Houston area after Harvey, that elevation is something to be done. So the question now is, it's not a question whether elevation should be done or not. Elevation should be done. The question is, well, how to do it safely the process and the engineering aspect of it so that we save money and we save casualties from the occupants from experiencing casualties, for example. So here is a graphic which shows the condition before elevation and after elevation. So this is the slab on grade, which you clearly see is resting continuously on the soil. There could be edge beam, which is a footer, 12-inch to 18-inch deep with some rebars in there. That makes it kind of rigid. And then we come in and we jack up the slab gradually. And then we put typically masonry piers underneath at some spacing. So you can imagine this slab, which is pretty weak to start with, now has to go through all this deformation because now it's not supported by soil anymore. So there's a weak points here, above the support, over here, over there. So the crack may happen right there in the plain concrete slab. And if we are not careful, then the slab may collapse, the home may collapse, and there could be unintended consequences from that. So to address this, I came up with this idea to do a pilot project at UT Arlington. I think it started in 2016 and ended in 2018. What we look at is that I am looking at how to make the slab safer and have some preliminary results. What we did, we built physically 2 slabs. Okay, these are 20 feet by 16 feet, mimicking the practical situation. This is a 4-inch slab, and the concrete was about 2,500 psi, typical field condition. So we put the wire mesh with the OSB formwork, and then we put the wire mesh on the bottom to mimic the field condition as you saw in the photograph. Then we had used ready-mix concrete to make up these slabs. We cured them for 28 days. And we also built a trough of OSB on the sides. So we had innovative way, an easy way to apply the load on the floor. As you know, the slab should have live load on it, the floor load. So we gradually applied water with the hose. And as the water height went up in the trough, the simulated live load on the floor would increase. So, and there'll be time when the slab will fail. We instrumented that with strain gauges, deflection meters, and we collected the data in a computer and then post-processed the data. So here are the results from that slab, one of the slab, which is a regular slab, no retrofitting, no strengthening. As expected, there's a crack on the top at the weak line on the support. The crack extended to the bottom. We know that because the water is leaking. I can see that here. And then the crack along the positive moment at the mid-span region at the bottom of the slab as expected. So what happened as we increased the water load, at about 18 inches of water, the slab suddenly collapsed. There was no warning. It was a very brittle failure expected of a slab, plain concrete slab, a weak slab. And this amounts to about 94 psi for floor live load, which you consider, if you consider the dead load from the slab, the self-weight of the slab itself, this is below what the IBC requires for residential home to have, the minimum capacity on the floor. You can see clearly the failure line. And if this happens in a real life structure, what will occur is that there'll be no warning at all. There'll be no deflection, no sagging, no cracking, no spalling. There'll be some cracking which may be hidden, and there'll be no warning at all. So a ductile structure as opposed to that would give occupants warning. There'll be sagging, there'll be cracking maybe on the ceramic tiles so that people can take evasive action. The structure could be saved by repair or retrofit, but that didn't simply happen in this case, which is a very worrisome thing for the occupants. So there's an innovative approach which are considering, which is conceptual at this time. It might be practical with some issues to be resolved. First of all, we sandblasted the surface. This is the second slab, the one didn't fail yet. We have to do sandblasting so that we can apply this carbon fiber wrap. It comes in a spool, about 3 feet wide. Some of you may be familiar with that. It has been used extensively for building retrofit, bridge retrofit, and other cases. So we just applied it on top of the slab at the expected weak point, if you remember, on the support. So the way to do that is the fabric And then we apply the epoxy glue on both surface of the fabric. And then the epoxy is applied on the top of the concrete. And then it's a simple matter of just putting it there, make sure there is no air pocket underneath the fabric. This could be applied on the top or bottom of the concrete slab to increase the strength and ductility. So after that, we tested it again under the same water load as I explained before. This time, surprise, we could increase the load to 28 inches of water, which is almost twice the 14 inches that we saw for the slab without any strengthening. And this is equivalent to 146 PSF of floor live load, which exceeds quite a bit the IBC requirement. If you remember, see here, there's no cracking on the bottom, which we saw in the previous slab. There's no water leakage, and the slab stood up nicely. Only reason we couldn't apply more load is we exceeded that trough height, which we couldn't exceed because the trough would start buckling on the sideways. But we achieved our objective of showing that the slab works as intended. Then, to extend the results, we did a computer model. What it does, it simulates the real life behavior. We use the Abacus finite element software. Let me go back here, which is essentially simulating the real life environment. We simulate the concrete slab, the beam, the pier, and the fabric. And this is the welded wire mesh inside that concrete, nicely shown here. And at the end, we show the program showed the cracking that happened on the support as we thought it should happen, as we saw in the experiment. So what's the advantage of the program? Well, now we can play with the parameters. We can increase the beam span. We can increase the spacing between the supports. We can vary the slab thickness. We can vary the concrete strength. And also we can try different kind of fabrics to see the end result. Doing this experimentally is simply impossible because the experiment costs a lot of money, but the computer program is cheap and we already have the program at the university. Further results from the computer model, we can see the stresses here, nicely shown, and the deflections. So we'll move along now for the time's sake. Here's the result. All I want to show you here, this is a plot of the pressure on the floor versus the displacement at the midspan. So this is the curve for the slab with the carbon fiber retrofit. Very high level of strength, and also you can note the ductility, which is quite a bit higher. All the other slabs, the experimental slab failed below, much below, less than half the load. So we proved the point that the carbon fiber really increases the capacity of the slab, which could be a viable option in future for retrofitting of wall slabs if the practicality of that can be worked out. So there was 79% increase of the failure load. So we still need to look at the variables, which we look at in the Texas Sea Grant project. So variables of the concrete strength. Do we have beams? We don't have support beams? What is the spacing between piers? And the slab thickness, among others. And other things could be when you connect the slab to the support, what type of connection do we have between that, the size of the support beam, and also the effect of the grade beam. We didn't do that in the preliminary study. Does it stiffen the slab enough to give it more strength? We need to study that as well. So the Texas Sea Grant project is very involved. It's a 2-year project. It's a collaborative effort. I'll explain that a little bit later on. So we have an advisory board. We look at the communities, hardly affected communities. We'll do more investigation experimentally. Big thing about this project is the development of a decision software. So what it will happen is that after we get everything done, we're gonna develop a very nice tool where users can input data, simple data, and then figure out the safety of the slab. So the target audience are the elevation contractors, engineers, homeowners, local, state, and federal officials, And then we're going to have quite a bit of outreach. I'll explain that later on in the presentation. It's a truly collaborative effort, as I explained. I'm very happy and proud to be part of this collaborative team. Myself from UT Arlington, I'm the project investigator, and my students from UT Arlington, Dr. Kaliu from TMU is the co-investigator with me, and she will have a graduate student involved. We also have several local governments, elevation contractors, and coastal engineers involved. And by the way, I'm putting a plug here for this collaborative effort. If you're interested in the collaboration, if you think you can help us somehow with advice or other things, please feel free to shoot me a line. I'll give you my email and phone number at the end of the presentation. With the advisory board is full of expertise. Ashley Bennis from Texas Sea Grant Planning. She's a Texas Sea Grant Planning specialist. And from day one, she has been involved with this project intimately. And thanks to Ashley for being a big part of the project. Catherine Como from Arkansas County. Roderick Scott, thanks Roderick. He's a home elevation contractor. Jason Reynolds from City of Nassau Bay. Sean Owens from San Patricia County. And we are in the process of adding an engineer, possibly from the City of Corpus Christi. And we're open to increasing the size of the advisory board if somebody is interested in joining it. So what will happen is every 6 months, we're going to have a conference call to look at the project progress. We will review the project deliverables at the end and also assist with the community involvement and extension. So the target communities, of course, are Harvey affected communities. And there's quite a bit in Texas, goes along the coast of Texas. So some of the communities, most of the communities had flood damage, but some of them had more wind damage than flood damage. So we will look at the smaller communities where it's easier to get data. For example, Arkansas County, San Patricia County, and then if we can, maybe Galveston County, and then parts of Harris County, for example, Nassau Bay, to see whether we can get some data from there. So we will need to show the application in these communities. So we will be doing 6 more slabs, investigation experimentally. If you remember, we did 2 slabs before. Now we're gonna extend that experimental scope. So we're gonna look at variables such as support pier span, pier spacing, and so forth. So what will happen is that this would be allowing us to get more confidence in the parametric study for the finite element program and make it more viable. The process will be very similar, using water load on the slabs and then testing them until failure. Dr. Kaliu at TMU will do the computer validation, which is essentially, again, using Abacus and extending with a parametric study, which also mimics the pilot study we did at UTA. And one thing we'll do now is that we're going to add wind load to the structure. So the previous study looked at only vertical load, but if you can imagine, an elevated structure may have more wind load applied. So how does it affect the slab behavior? We'll study that. And it will be validated with experimental result from UTA. So I mentioned the web tool. This is an exciting part of this project. So we're going to use either Visual Basic and or Excel, web-based. So we're going to develop a mobile phone version of it and also a PC version of it. And it will be done at a layman's level so that highly technical expertise will not be necessary. Things like, okay, do you know the concrete strength or the slab thickness? If not, we're going to use default values, which is typically 4-inch and 3000 PSI. Then important thing would be the dimension of the slab. And then if the slab support is already known, the kind of pier and the spacing that could be input. So output will be whether that is safe, if this elevation process safe or the parameters safe. Vice versa, if only the slab parameters are input, then we could be able to suggest safe elevation parameters. For example, again, the beam type and then the support spacing and so forth. Then if somebody wants to retrofit to increase the strength, in case the slab is weak, then we can suggest retrofit options, for example, carbon fiber and others if feasible. So after that, we'll be we'll be helping the elevation contractors on 2 real-life elevation projects. We hope to find 2 of them in the communities that we are partnering with. So we'll be working with the homeowner, the contractor, and local officials. We're going to apply the tool we developed and figure out how easy it's to use and maybe improve that based on the input from the stakeholders and elevate the structure and look at the convenience, the efficiency of the software. And then we're going to tweak the software at the end as needed. The big part of the project is also the education, training, outreach material. So we'll develop a lot of them, decision tool, the web tool. We're going to have design charts like this. This is simple to understand. This is a load versus beam spacing or support spacing. So based on the slab thickness, we could develop simple safety charts. This is the safety level. And you can see here, as the slab thickness goes up, the strength goes up as expected. So this could be simple things like a graphical interface where users could use the hard copy of it, or it could be available in the web tool, for example. We're going to develop slide presentations, website. We're going to present at conferences such as this one here, and then publish in journals so that we can reach out to a wide audience. So the workshops, interesting. We're going to have 6 altogether, hopefully. So we are supposed to have one at the TWDB annual meeting last May, which got canceled, but it's approved. So hopefully, if that meeting is rescheduled, we'll be on that program. We also want to have workshop at the community level, invite stakeholders, have them help us in the assessment, have a pre-survey and post-survey done. So pre-survey will be before the use of the web tool at the workshop, and post-survey after the use of the web tool. See how much impact we made on the perception of those stakeholders about the elevation process. All of this will be free. Workshop will be free. The decision software will be free, and all the other interfaces will be free as well. I mentioned the assessment already. Educating stakeholders, we'll do that. Change perceptions, we'll do the assessment as well. And to have interested stakeholders adopt the decision model in the future, that will be long-term assessment. We can go back to the communities every few years and see how many people use our software and the design aids to assess the impact. SIG-Grant really wants us to do that, so we'll try to do that with time. Time schedule, this is a 2-year project. So we just finished the first quarter. So this is gonna go on until 2022. So this is, I'm not gonna go elaborating on this one. We have covered most of this already. It's pretty involved. If you see, there's overlap of some tasks. Some of that will be done at UTA. Some of that will be done at Texas A&M, and some of the experimental, and some of the theoretical, and some of them extension work. So what are the remaining issues after this project? I think this will be really a milestone, this project, in terms of understanding the elevation process, understanding the engineering side of it, understanding the human side of it, understanding the social science part of it. But there are remaining issues. For example, the elevation cost is very high. So how do homeowners get access to the funds? How to reduce that fund? That will be something that will be in the future. What are the contractor's responsibility, for example? Do they have any liabilities post elevation? What are the effect of buyout versus elevation? And I think in this session there is another presentation from Kathy Hopkins, which will look at that, and then the social aspects of these factors and more. So there are a lot of remaining issues that has to be figured out to make the results more broad-based. So that's the end of my presentation. I think I'm within time. So I know there will be no questions. There will be questions. This is a recorded presentation. So I'll be there during the question answer part of that. And I like to meet with some of you. Hopefully you'll be in the audience, and then we can we can answer any questions you have. Thank you very much for your time and attention. And during the question answer, I'll give you my contact information. I can give it now. It's my last name, Yazdani, Yazdani @uta.edu. And my phone number is 817-272-0676. I forgot to mention that in the slides. My apologies. Thank you very much for your time, and enjoy the rest of the conference, and looking forward to speaking to you soon or being in touch with you. Thank you. Have a good day.
Okay, so that was the presentation, and now we have Nur here with us to answer some questions. The first one, what is the average cost per square foot of elevating a structure? And would you recommend elevating or floodproofing structures?
Good question, kind of loaded question here. So the average home, about 1,500 square feet, will cost about $100,000 or more. So I didn't make calculator to see per square feet, but you can do the calculations. So let's see. I don't know, on the top of my head. I'm thinking could be anywhere from $50 to $60 per square feet. I may be wrong, you know. Floodproofing now depends on what method you use. There's so many methods. Kathy Hopkins mentioned those. You can do dry floodproofing. You can do wet floodproofing. You can do lay-bys, water-resistant paints, sump pumps, things like that. They could be cheaper, one or two options. But if you look at the elevation, it's really a foolproof system. So all you're doing is raising it all the way above the flood level. So there is absolutely no chance the structure will be flooded or there will be damage unless the flood event is higher than you expected. So we typically design for a 100-year flood event, but suppose Harvey was somebody people say it's 500-year flood event. In that case, you may be unlucky and you may have damage. So you have this is all a matter of cost benefit and the calculations like that. That's a good question. Yeah.
Okay, the next one, FRP works well theoretically on a flat bare slab, but how would you apply this technique to existing homes with slab foundations and interior walls to disrupt edge-to-edge FRP application?
Yeah, I know, and that's another question we're grappling with. Typically, it will be easier to apply in the bottom. For obvious reasons, the bottom is bare. It may be uneven, it may be soil. Once you elevate the structure, there'll be soil on the surface. So if you wash out the surface, it's easily applied in the bottom. Whoever asked the question is correct about the top. We have floor coverings, we have interior walls. So that's the issue. Typically, the weak line will be along the wall where the beam will sit. Now, one of that would be to have the beam line sitting in the middle of the slab. Again, the carpet is easier, and if it's under the wall, you can do some spot bearing of the wall, take the sill plate out, and use pieces of carbon fiber, not a whole strip. So these are things that somebody has to figure out. Hopefully, we will the practicality of it. That's something that that's a very good question to see how to do this from a practical point of view.
Okay. How would the carbon fiber strip be applied to a slab under a house in a real world situation before lifting?
Well, we are using it a lot in buildings, not on the slab itself, but on shear walls. Coastal area, the shear wall is corroded, the rebars are rusted. So then we just go out, a very similar process, we sandblast it, and then we apply the carbon fiber. The bottom line is it's a very thin product. It practically takes no space. Can you imagine a product which is 0.5 millimeter thick? So it virtually takes no space from the usable space inside the room, outside. We're applying it to the bridges for bridge retrofit, for Texas Beauty, for example, retrofitting girders, which have been hit by traffic and damaged. So coming back to the question, if it's a slab on ground, all you can do is apply on the top, but I'm not sure why you'd like to do that, because the slab on ground, as I mentioned today, is not very weak because it's continuously supported by the soil. So if it cracks, it's not a structural crack, it's going to be shrinkage crack or something like that. which is not bothersome as long as you can hide it or somehow repair it. So there may be no need for retrofitting a slab which is on the ground unless there's a lot of foundation damage, foundation issues. We have typical foundation used in North Texas. We have expensive clay so that the homes kind of settle on one side and cracks. In that case, it can be used, but only on the top of the slab. And again, falling back to the previous question where somebody asked about the practicality of using on top, that could be difficult to implement. Of course, you can apply it to your masonry walls. You can apply to timber connection, for example, trusses and things like that can be used as well. But one thing to keep in mind, it's not very cheap. So this product is getting more and more popular. You can buy a 300 feet spool now, 3 feet wide for about $300. I remember 5 years back, it was $2,000. So the price is coming down as more people are using it. There are several manufacturers manufacturing it, Simpson, Strong Tie, Sika, Five, among others, and they're very willing to reach out to the communities and help with them with any projects they may have.
Okay, great. Well, I think that's our time. Thank you, everybody, for coming to this session, the last session, and hopefully we'll see each other next year in Raleigh.
Thank you. Thank you for your time. And now it's time to go out and celebrate. You're all done, right? So,
Done.
thank you. I appreciate your time.